you've been with us, we're going through a series called Chill, how to engage and embrace and experience God's fullness. And a big part of Chill is learning how to enter into this space called Sabbath. Sabbath is something that we see unfold in the Old Testament. Most people say it's just rest, but resting was always followed up with dwelling. When we talk about what we're looking at in these ancient of days, the time frame is always this space. And as we talk about rest, we also talk about recreation last week. How do you have some fun? How do you enjoy that? How do you find places to let the hair down, so to speak? But today we talk about Sabbath as resistance. This is a big week for my family. Like, Anna Grace is getting married on Saturday. Emma was accepted to med school last Wednesday. Daniel will be a certified nutritionist as of Tuesday. And like all these things are all kind of growing and moving. And I mean, so we're excited for them, right? And Christina got her first hit and scored yesterday. So like all these things are kind of like rolling and we're excited for them, you know. But there's these pieces where like in the middle of joy and excitement and process, like the thing that almost happens next is the weight of disappointment. Because you got to be careful when you watch achievement and drivenness where that leads us to. Christina got a hit. She gets a run. The next game, she gets a hit. She gets out, tagged out at third. It was a forced out. Nothing she could do about it. She was devastated. I was there first. Well, actually, she wasn't. I was the third base coach. I saw what happened. No, you're out. It's okay. The next game, she doesn't get a hit. Girl hasn't got a hit for 9 games. She finally hits the ball. She scores a run, and now she thinks, every time, this is what I have to do. You go from those things where recreation leads to accomplishment and achievement. And then all of a sudden, achievement becomes demand. I did it once, I can do it again. I did it once, I can do it every time. And we get stuck. And in the middle of that space, we forget how to dwell. If Sabbath is about rest, it's as much about dwelling. And when we go into these spaces, Sabbath becomes the ultimate resistance to a world that wants to suck everything from you. So not only do we talk about Sabbath as a discipline of finding joy and delight, we also find Sabbath as a refusal to be demanded of in unhealthy, ungodly ways. And that's what we're going to get into this morning, Sabbath as resistance. Remember, Shabbat is the word that we most often see. It means to rest. The text that we're going to look at today, before they ever heard the Ten Commandments, God told Israel to do something because this day is a Sabbath. Could you imagine hearing a word for the very first time and not knowing what it is and going, well, what do we do with it? What is it supposed to look like? And in that same conversation where Sabbath appears, Nuach comes right behind, to dwell, to be together, to be in this space and to be with God. And that's where we start to find the dynamics of Sabbath as resistance. When we think about Sabbath, Sabbath is not simply the pause that refreshes. Like so many times, we just got to put our feet up. We had a tournament yesterday, so we're playing from the morning through the afternoon. We got to one game. It got all the way up to 87 degrees yesterday. There's no shade on the baseball field, by the way. No wind was moving, and the girls were just sapped. And I'm like, we could sit in the car and drink cold water, but we're close enough to the house that we can go put our feet up for a minute. What do you want to do? And they're like, Dad, let's go home for a minute. So we ran home. We had 40 minutes just kind of chill out and get back to the game. They were refreshed and ready to play. Sabbath isn't just a pause that refreshes. It is a pause that transforms. When we really engage this space of resting and dwelling, it is transformative in the way it works in our lives. And that's what we're going to witness when we enter into Sabbath as resistance. In our own contemporary context of the rat race, Have y'all heard that phrase before, the rat race? Like we live in the rat race. It's a really funny movie. That's a whole different conversation. But in the form of, if you haven't seen Rat Race, this is not a pastoral recommendation. Watch it. You go through these dynamics, right? Anxiety is right a part of that. The celebration of Sabbath in the light of a cultural that demanding anxiety-driven rat race, Sabbath is an act of resistance and an alternative. Not only does it say, I'm not going to live that way, I'm going to live this way. Sabbath is an act of resistance, and it's an alternative to everything else around us. And do you know what this world is most longing to see? Is the witness of difference. What difference does your faith make? And yet most of us who call Jesus King live no differently than the world that's around us, so no one can see the difference it makes. Certainly when we grieve, we can say God's with us in the hard things. But what happens when we live under the weight and the demand of a system that just drives and drives and drives, and we just enter the rat race like everybody else? Sabbath becomes the ultimate witness to a world around us when we live into it. It is resistance and it's alternative. When we look at this, it's a resistance because Sabbath is a visible insistence that our lives are not defined by the production and consumption of commodity goods. You are more than climbing a corporate ladder. I listen to a broad range of music, from things that happened before I was born to things that are still happening right now, to country music, to rock music, to rap music, to R&B, to Motown, to classical. I listen to a broad range of music. And interestingly enough, over the last week, I have Sirius XM. I'm going through all these different channels. I like to push channels more than I do listen to music. I don't know, you may be like me, but I like to push the buttons more than actually listen to the whole song. But I heard all these different songs on all these different channels where the tension of the song was I was living somebody else's dream. And every single thing around living somebody else's dream was centered around work that was demanding and obtrusive to the life the person singing the song wished they had. It wasn't about lost romance. It wasn't about a broken down pickup truck. It wasn't about a dog. It wasn't about streets. It was about work that is demanding, and I'm living somebody else's dream. And Sabbath tells us that our lives are more than just being commodity. Most of us in this room are the commodity of somebody else's business. I remember when I was going to college, the no more lawyers were needed. Good night. We didn't need another lawyer in the United States. It's an oversaturated career, so don't go into political science or law. Don't go into psychology. There's enough psychologists out there. What we really need are IT people. I was like, ooh. Then God called me to ministry, quick. I told God that I could become an IT person and he would never have to give me a paycheck. God's like, it's not how it works. I want all of you. This is how it's going to work. Some people are going to do that, but this is how it's going to work for you. I was like, okay. So I didn't go into IT. I became an English major instead. Lucrative career, I'm telling you. So then, a couple of years later, it went from IT all about engineers. We need engineers, we need engineers, we need engineers, we need engineers. And all kinds of engineers. We need engineers, we need engineers, we need engineers. And then lawyers came back in the cycle. And do you know what the number one fastest growing job market is today? Psychology. Welcome to a post-COVID world, by the way. And do you know why they didn't need any more lawyers at the time? Because the lawyers were still young enough to have a career. Then they all got old. And we need people to run the machine. And why did engineers become so profound? There was science that was moving, but all the engineers who were building and shaping things, they all got old. And we needed more engineers for the machine. then we needed more lawyers for the machine, and more psychologists for the machine, and then we need more doctors for the machine. And we live our lives listening to a job market that is driving you, a precious child of God, made and deeply fashioned with interests and passions and hobbies and loves and emotions, and you are treated as a commodity by the world around you. You will die as a cog in the machine if you do not resist. And Sabbath says there's a better way. It is resistance and it's alternative. And that's what God is trying to invite us into. It's a resistance to anxiety. And we see this unfold in Exodus. You got to go back to where it begins. This is Exodus chapter 5. Moses shows up on the scene. And Moses goes to Pharaoh. And Moses has a speech impediment. He says to God he has a stutter. He can't really talk straight, so he wants Aaron to talk for him. Somehow, in my mind, I've said this before, please forgive me, but in my mind, Moses sounds like Elmer Fudd. Not Charlton Heston, let my people go, or the NRA will find you. You know, it's not Charlton Heston. For me, it's more like Moses, and he's like, Pharaoh, let my people go, you know? And you're just like, I don't know what happened in Pharaoh's chamber that day, but Moses and Aaron, this is what it said. Moses and Aaron, because Moses tells God, I'll do whatever you want, but I'm not talking for you. So you get someone to talk for, fine, your brother Aaron will talk for you. So they show up in that Pharaoh's chamber, and they make these demands. And he says, let my people go so that they may hold a festival for me in the wilderness. But Pharaoh responded, who is this Lord that I should obey? Remember, Pharaoh thinks he's God, by the way. In Egypt, Pharaoh was the living embodiment of the sun. Ra. And this is Pharaoh. Who's bigger than me? What are you demanding of me? Who is this Yahweh that I should obey him by letting Israel go? I don't know him. And besides, I will not let Israel go. The God of the Hebrews has met with us. Please, let us take this 3-day trip to the wilderness so that we may sacrifice to the Lord, or else he may strike us with plagues or by sword. Pharaoh said to them, Moses and Aaron, why are you causing the people to neglect their work? Get to your labor. Pharaoh also said, look, the people of the land are so numerous, and you would stop them from their labor? From that day on, Pharaoh commanded the overseers of the people, as well as their foremen, don't continue to supply the people with straw for making bricks as before. They must gather straw for themselves, but require the same quota. The demands of the world were sapping the lives of the Israelites. And by the world, we mean Pharaoh. Bricks without straw, but the same number of bricks. Pharaoh doesn't listen. The plagues come, the deliverance comes, the march out of Egypt comes. Pharaoh's armies swamped in the oceans, and on the other side of that, freedom. And in the middle of that freedom, we get this. This is before the 10 Commandments come. It says, the Lord spoke to Moses. He says, I've heard the complaints of the Israelites. Tell them at twilight you will eat a meal, and in the morning you will eat bread until you are full, and you will know that I am the Lord your God. So at evening time, quail came and covered the camp. In the morning there was a layer of dew around the camp. The layer of dew evaporated. There were fine flakes on the desert surface, as fine as frost on the ground. One Israel saw it and asked another, what is it? Because they didn't know. Moses says, it's bread from heaven the Lord has given you. And this is what the Lord has commanded. Gather as much as each person needs to eat. You may take 2 quarts per person according to the number of people in your home. So the Israelites did this. They gathered a lot and some a little. They measured it by quarts. The person who gathered a lot had no surplus, and the person who gathered a little had no shortage. Each gathered as much as was needed to eat. And Moses said to them, no one is to let any of it remain until morning. But they didn't listen to Moses. Some people left part of it until morning, and worms took in and stank. Moses was angry with them. They gathered it every morning. Each gathered as much as he needed to eat, but when the sun grew hot, it melted. On the 6th day, they gathered twice as much, 4 quarts apiece, and all the leaders of the community reported to Moses. He told them, This is what the Lord has said. Tomorrow is a day of complete rest. It is a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you want to bake, boil what you want to boil, set it aside, left over to be kept to morning. And so they did, just as Moses commanded. For 6 days you will gather, but on the seventh it is a Sabbath. There will be nothing to be done. All they could do was rest. All they could do was be with their community, with their family, in the wilderness, a creation moment, and with God. There were no demands of Pharaoh. The 7-day work schedule was over. The bricks without straw schedule was over, and God was inviting them into a space that was uniquely different. Sabbath was as much of an anti-Pharaoh world as it was a pro-God world. And we have to resist both. We live in a world that is overcome by anxiety. The Attorney General of the United States issued a declaration of loneliness, an epidemic of loneliness and anxiety in the United States 2 Fridays ago. Smoking warning, food warning, alcohol warning, anxiety and loneliness warning. Attorney General. And our world has no invitation to resist outside of the way of Jesus. And yet, even for those of us who believe, we allow ourselves to be overrun by the demands of Pharaoh. What do we do? How do we resist? Those who participate in Sabbath can break the anxiety cycle of demand. When we come into these spaces, we start to walk through like God's world, like the world that God made is an anxiety-free world of well-being. Doesn't that sound great? That sounds better than a 3-day cruise that you need one more day of vacation to recover from before you go back to work. An anxiety-free world of well-being, because the Creator is anxiety-free and publicly exhibits that freedom. Freedom from anxiety. And he doesn't check out. He's there. He is completely giving freedom. Learning to experience God's fullness means to embrace nullifying entire systems of anxiety and production demanded by the rulers of this world. Sabbath is the ultimate protest to a world that would crush you for its own benefits. Sabbath is resistance. When we think about this, like human life is made to conform to the rhythms of creation. Isn't it interesting that we went back to Genesis 1 and we start to see the ebb and the flow of the day, that there was morning and there was evening, and it was the first day and it was good. And God put seasons in place and stars in place and the sun and the moon and everything. And there was this ebb and this flow. And then as all the work was completed, there was actually an ebb and flow of work and rest. What happens when we don't live into the rhythm God created us to be into? Everything gets upside down. When human persons are in sync with that, we can rest and we can be free from anxiety. For some of us who struggle with anxiety, that sounds almost impossible. And there are others of us who don't know that we struggle with anxiety because it's the only life we know. This life of demand and production and commodity. Where does it come from? Why does it drive us? And how do we find peace? God continues to tell us the answer. It's a resistance to coercion. You ever been forced to do something you didn't want to do? Something that you knew was just wrong, but it was being demanded of you anyway. I had gone 6 months unemployed. Corey and I thought we had a job lined up in Washington, D.C. after graduating from seminary. Large church wanted me to be the pastor of young adults. They went through a budget crisis, and the brand new position was the first one cut. Last one in, first one out. I didn't have a day on the job before they told me I didn't have it anymore. We had no backup plan. I taught school. I did not renew my teaching contract. We found out in August that we weren't being hired. We thought we were moving in September. I had nothing. I got my last teacher's check the day I found out they weren't hiring me. For 6 months, I couldn't get a job. I was overqualified to flip hamburgers at McDonald's. Could you believe that? I was overqualified to make coffee at Starbucks. For whatever reason, I could not get a job. It was crushing. I was raised kind of old school by a Great Depression man who was like, men provide. And you do whatever you can, and I was doing whatever I could, and I couldn't get a foot in the door. And one day I got offered a job, headhunting in the business world, where you would sit in an office and you would call people at their office and offer them better jobs with better benefits to see if they would leave their company. And they gave me a one-day test run to see how good I could be at the job. And I got through the system, because you got to navigate the gatekeepers to get past their phone systems and get to the person you want to talk to, because it's a weird world and a raw deal. And so I'm talking to this guy, and I'm like, here's the job, here's the deal. He's like, how did you get my number? I said, it's just kind of a long story, but if you want the job, it's yours. Like, they want to hire you, they know your record. And he's like, I don't want the job, please don't call me back, I'm happy where I am. I'm like, cool, I'll never call you again. Hang up. As we're wrapping up the office, the company manager's like, that was great, you did such a good job. Tomorrow you're going to call that guy back and we're going to reel him in. And I was like, no. I told that man I would never call him again. Yeah, but you work for us. I'm like, no, I told that man I would never call him again. My word is bigger than this company. And they said, well, go home and think about it. So I went home. I told Corey in tears, I just got a job and I have to quit it. I am so sorry. And she says, we're going to be okay. Integrity's matter. It's more than a paycheck. So the next morning I woke up, I put my suit on, I drove an hour across the Metroplex through traffic. I went into that place and I told that man where his job could land. That life was bigger than the demand. I think I had my tie off my neck before I left the door. How do we resist coercion? Where does it begin? How do we resist these things? I mean, Pharaoh just demanded. Sabbath resists the world's coercion. It lets go. It's not a lazy let go. It's an intentional let go, right? So we let go. Sabbath's one demand. Like, God is demanding, right? Even in that place where Jesus says to us, take my yoke upon you, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. There is still a yoke and there is still a burden. And if we had time to talk about ox carts and how they line up, we would go through that today. They're still there. But he says, for my yoke is easy, my burden is light. You will find rest for your soul. There are still demands in the kingdom. And those demands are that you honor God, creation, and neighbor. That we love God with everything we have. That we live at unity with the creation. That we love our neighbors as we love ourselves. That is pretty demanding. But it's a resistant world. That's the one demand of Sabbath. Sabbath actually calls us to execute that at its highest form by putting everything else aside and just paying attention to those spaces. We talk about Sabbath. The way of this world is to turn our neighbors into competitors. People that we are called to love as equals become rungs on a ladder that we are intended to climb. In the corporate world, it's not who do you bring with you, it's who do you step on to get ahead. In Jesus' world, it's who do we bring with us? Who do we bring with us along the journey of faith to Christ? It's a very different world. Our neighbors become resources. The things that God gave us to live well become commodities, and faith becomes a crutch. Do you really need this to get by? Please, Moses said, just let us have this festival of worship in the wilderness for 3 days. And some of us are so afraid to just ask off for Sunday. Well, what if somebody else gets the job instead? Okay. What if? How does it unfold? How do we live into a world that resists? Those who embrace Sabbath become free to be rather than forced to do. And we were made with being in mind. That's who we are. We are human beings, not human doings. And that nomenclature is so important. But when we live into a world of just do and do and do some more, we often lose our being. We become the job rather than being a person. And Sabbath forces us to let go in a beautiful way. It is the ultimate rebellion. So how do you find time to practice resistance? How do we resist Pharaoh? Some of us in this room, the harshest Pharaoh you serve looks at you in the mirror every morning. You have to do more, work harder, try harder, be better. The harshest Pharaoh you serve is in your mirror. It's okay to let go. It's okay to resist. You are more than what you do. For some of us, the harshest Pharaoh is everything that our neighbor has. Like when you start to watch the Ten Commandments, it's really awesome. When you watch the language of the Sabbath commandment, and it goes into your slaves, your servants, your donkeys, your oxes, your women, like all of these things. And then you watch the dynamic, the last commandment on coveting. What does it go through? His wife, his women, his children, his stuff, his donkeys, his servants, his ox. Goes through it follows the exact same order. The freedom that Sabbath gives also gives you freedom from keeping up with the Joneses. So how do we find time to chill? One, we have to figure out, where does Pharaoh's driven productivity govern your life? Who's your Pharaoh? Is it your retirement plan? Is it your boss, your job? Is it the person in the mirror? Is it your spouse? You got some conversations to have across the board. Who's the Pharaoh that's driving you that God is wanting to free you from so that you can rest? We got to figure that space out. It's a question that we all have to answer. Who's Pharaoh? Who is the one that's telling you bricks without straw in your soul? We got to figure that out. When we start to process then, now we figure this out. How do we let go? How do we resist the demands? There's a few things to it. One, don't bring work home. Like, let work be work. This is the absolute hardest thing for me, mostly because of this little guy right here. Everything that I can do on my big machine, I can do on this little machine. And if I open that little machine up, I can do sermon prep, I can read, I can post my slides, I can answer emails. I could go all day without ever taking a break. Don't bring work home. Let work be work, let home be home. And if you have to bring work home, call your significant other and tell them, I'm going to be late. Go to Starbucks and finish the work. Don't take it home. When you walk in the door, be home. If you live alone, when you walk in the door, be home. Don't bring work home. You're more than that job. Schedule time away from work. It's very healthy. The work at your job, either someone else will help you do it, or it will be waiting for you when you get back. It's not going to spoil and stink like worms and stuff, like the manna from heaven. I mean, it may stink like worms already, but that's a whole different conversation about work, right? Schedule time away from work. And for those of you who are working right now, unretired, don't wait to retirement to schedule time away. Schedule time away now. At Cornerstone, one of the ways that we care for our staff is we have a use it or lose it policy with vacation. I want our staff to take their time off with freedom anytime they need to. And if you don't take time off in the year, one, we're going to have a hard question about that at the end of the year. Two, you're not going to have those days carry over to the next year. We want you to take your time off. It's okay. Cornerstone will survive without us. You've done it before, you'll do it again. But just for like a week at a time, this time. You take time off. Your time off and the space of your soul is better than the cash out at the end of the year. Because in the long run, you'll actually have more years to do that thing that you like to do that you call work, if you take care of yourself now. Take time off. Pray through your jealous Joneses. There's this old phrase that says, keeping up with the Joneses. And you see people, they got stuff that you want, and the only way for you to get it is to work harder. And you allow that thing or that stuff to kind of drive what you want. Pray through your jealous Joneses. Because if you had those things, guess what's going to happen? Another Jones is going to have something that you don't have. And then you got to go fight for that one too. Paul says this, in the context of commodity and finances. Paul says, I have learned, whether rich or poor, with plenty or with nothing, to be content in all things. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. That verse is so beautifully quoted by so many people who believe in Jesus, but it sits in the middle of a conversation on economic stability. Not about going to the doctor and getting a diagnosis. Not about doing something hard that you've never done before. It is about being content in the world that God gave. I can live in this world because Christ strengthens me. That's the context of the verse. It's almost a Sabbath refreshing verse. I can be content in everything. Pray through your jealous Joneses. Invite a neighbor, broad definition, to share in Sabbath with you. Whatever that Sabbath thing that you love is, bring somebody with you so that they're not a competitor, they're not a commodity, they're not a resource, they are a neighbor that we are called to love. Invite that person along. Bring them with you. Maybe it's a coworker, maybe it's a real neighbor next door, maybe it's someone who's close to you at church. Whatever it is, bring someone with you to embrace Sabbath together. And enjoy that unity of life that comes by resisting the demands of the world. This is Jesus, Lord of the Sabbath. Not just telling us what not to do, but inviting us to an alternative as well. Jesus doesn't say, take my yoke upon you so that you become overburdened by something else. The way of Jesus isn't an add-on to our lives. It is to become our lives. And Sabbath is part of that life.